Peter, one of the original apostles of Jesus, had just got back from a crazy time in the city of Joppa, where he'd seen firsthand that the message of Jesus Christ wasn't just for Jews. Upon returning home to Jerusalem, he and his fellow Christians faced opposition at the hands of King Herod, but thanks to some divine intervention, Peter escaped to tell the tale. Shortly after, Herod died, and things calmed down. Meanwhile, up north in Antioch, the apostle Barnabas had met up with Paul, who was previously called Saul, and for the last year or so they'd been teaching Christian converts there. During Herod's persecution, they'd taken aid back to Jerusalem, and picking up a fellow traveller called Mark for the journey home, they went back to Antioch, although they wouldn't be staying there for long. During a time of prayer and fasting, some prophets and teachers received a message during their meditations that both Paul and Barnabas had got work to do. After further prayer and the laying on of hands, the two set off on their journey. It's probably worth mentioning at this point what the phrase laying on of hands means. Essentially, you place your hands on someone to ask God to either bless them in some way, such as healing, or request that the Holy Spirit comes to rest on the person and guide them in their endeavours. This practice, of course, was first found in Judaism, with a similar tone of blessing or conferring of authority, so it's not surprising then that the early, mostly Jewish church had adapted it into their faith. With the formalities done, Paul and Barnabas set off for Cyprus to start teaching and preaching, and headed to the synagogues in Salamis, aided by a man named John. They travelled across the island preaching their message, until eventually they finally arrived in Paphos, where the local proconsul summoned the two to listen to what they'd got to say. However, one of his attendants, a sorcerer by the name of Bar-Jesus, also known as Elymas or the Wise, wasn't too keen on their message and began to oppose it. Paul eventually got fed up with him and declared that he was going against God, and that for a time he would be blinded, and shortly after, Elymas lost his sight and, amazed, the proconsul then was quite eager to listen to what the two men had got to say. After a little while, the mission set off to Perga in Pamphylia, and John said his goodbyes to head back to Jerusalem, while Paul and Barnabas set off to Pisidian Antioch. Another little side note here, there were two Antiochs in the first century, because why not? Once again, Paul and Barnabas started preaching in local synagogues, giving long, impassioned speeches about how Jesus fit into the long history of the Jewish people, and that he was the promised Messiah, or sent one of God that they'd all been waiting for. Many wanted to know and invited them back to preach, and the two men managed to gain a following, but their preaching was seen as a bit too much for some of the Jewish communities, who began to stir up trouble and eventually had them expelled from the area. The two men were not discouraged, however, but as a symbolic gesture of what they thought of all these troublemakers, they shook the dust from their feet in protest as they set off to Iconium. Shaking the dust from your feet was sending a message, and it was a Jewish practice that Jesus himself mentioned. If they reject your message, leave them to it, including the dust from the ground they walk on. As soon as they arrived in Iconium, the dynamic duo carried on with business as usual, going into synagogues, preaching the message, but again they had mixed results with the community there, with people either listening to what they had to say or plotting to get rid of them. One such plot involved stoning them, and since they weren't too keen on that idea, Paul and Barnabas set off to continue their work in the cities of Lystra and Derbe as soon as they'd heard that. Now in the city of Lystra, things got a bit awkward. During another one of his grand preaches, Paul healed a lame man, and the people there declared that Barnabas, therefore, must be Zeus, and Paul, since he was the chatty one, must be Hermes, come to visit. Even more awkwardly, the local priest of Zeus brought a bull along so the locals could offer sacrifices to them. Paul and Barnabas passionately tried to tell the crowd that they were just mere men and tried to tell them about Jesus, but with some cajoling by their detractors, the crowd soon turned nasty and started to stone Paul, dumping him outside the city and leaving him for dead. The disciples they had taught came and found them very much alive, and the next day Paul and Barnabas left quietly, setting off to Derbe, where they had more success. After all of this excitement, they decided it was time to head home, and stopped in at Lystra, Iconium and Pisidian Antioch, where they taught a bit more and appointed leaders before heading back to their original Antioch to give account of their journey. When they arrived, they discovered that the church there had received some visitors, and upon listening to them speak, both men started to argue with them. The dispute was over circumcision. The visitors said that to be truly saved and to be part of the church, you needed to be circumcised. Now, having spent a lot of time amongst non-Jewish believers and seeing their faith, the two missionaries disagreed. Seeing that they were at an impasse, the leaders of the Antioch church decided to send both Paul, Barnabas and a few others to Jerusalem to ask what the original disciples of Jesus thought about this issue. When they arrived, they told the tales of the missionary journeys to an eager audience before posing the question of whether or not these new converts should be circumcised. Discussions began, and those who had converted from the Pharisees were very much in favour of the new converts following Jewish laws, but then someone stood up to give his opinion. It was Peter. Peter reminded them of his encounter with Cornelius, stating that something new was going on here, that both Jews and non-Jews were part of this new move of God, and asked Paul and Barnabas to give the full details of their journeys together. Once they had finished their tale, another one of the original disciples stood up to speak, and this time it was James, who said, "Look, Peter's got a point, and I think we shouldn't burden the new believers with a load of Jewish laws. We should write them a letter with some of the basics in." And that's what they did. Barnabas and Paul returned to Antioch with the apostles' letter to distribute, which gave out a few instructions for holiness. Don't eat food sacrificed to idols, avoid blood, don't eat anything that's been strangled, and don't be sexually immoral. This was the end of Paul's first missionary journey, but it wouldn't be too long before he was set off again. Tune in next time to learn about his second missionary journey, and if you don't want to miss it, hit subscribe and maybe check out some of the other stuff on my channel. Until then, why not grab a drink and keep asking questions?